The UN warns that it no longer has enough money to keep global malnutrition at bay and predicts further shortages amid concern about rising food costs. How can the poor cope, and what is the world doing about it? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Gata. What would you do if the price of essential food items suddenly doubled? That's the dilemma people across the Middle East are facing. In Jordan, the price of some staples has risen over 100% in just a month. And last week, dozens of Moroccans were sentenced to jail after rioting over food prices. Mohammed Shukair has more on the inflation and what's behind it.
For these people, a loaf of bread may soon become a distant dream. The expected hike in wheat prices reveals the looming rise of hunger in some parts of the world. And it coincides with the spectacular growth in wealth that others enjoy. With a growing number of people bearing the brunt of these price shocks, the Food and Agriculture Organization warns of not being able to fulfill its obligations. It's demanding an increase in funding to meet the increasing needs of the poor.
Between 1990-92 and 2002-2004, the prevalence of hunger increased from 13 to 15% of the population, while the number of undernourished people increased by 33 million to a total of 104.
These shocking figures at the FAO conference in Cairo recently sounded the alarm. It's climate change, shortage of water, reduction of investment, as well as the shrinking subsidies by governments, which have all contributed in the hunger scare overshadowing the entire Middle East. Not everyone can cope.
An unusual increase in prices. The poor man will have to resort to any means possible to survive. The Minister of Agriculture warns us from an upcoming famine, but does nothing about it. What do you expect us to do?
All prices have gone up. Bread, fish, everything. People can't find food to eat.
During the last year, a ton of wheat was only 1,200 pounds. Today, it is more than 3,000 pounds. I used to bake 20 sacks of flour a day. Now I cannot bake more than 10 a day.
The victim has always been the poor citizen, whether he is a farmer or a consumer. And while governments in some rich countries subsidize farmers and destroys excess production of wheat to maintain a minimum market price, poor countries are gradually reducing their subsidies, leaving the gap between the rich and the poor wider than ever.
Well, joining us to discuss this issue are our guests. In Dubai, Ibrahim Khayat, he's a strategic and business analyst. In Cairo, Majdi Sobi is an economic expert from Al-Ahram Center for Strategic Studies. And in Rome, Abdul Reza Abbasian, he's an economist at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. Welcome, gentlemen. Mr. Sobi in Cairo, if I could start off with you, is this really a crisis?
I think so, because you have a double of everything actually coming from abroad. You have the financial crisis, you have now this hikes of prices of the main actually commodities which everybody consume in the country. So you have a crisis, of course.
And Egypt, Morocco and others have seen riots, Mr. Sobi. Could this go so far as to maybe topple regimes because of the anger, hunger and desperation of people?
I don't think so, actually, because up till now you have some tensions between people themselves, between people and the government, between opposition and the government. But in the last analysis, you have efforts from the government to cope with this crisis. Up till now, it is not actually affect the market, but the people themselves, deal with the crisis as if it is everybody actually daily life in Cairo from long time ago. So you can't predict this special crisis to be the one that will lead to crisis, to riots and then anything else.
Mr. Abbasian, we know that the poor are the ones that really suffer. Who benefits from rising food prices?
Well, it's naturally farmers would benefit from rising prices. Of course, this assumes that farmers would receive these high prices. Many countries, especially in the region, have quite an important farming sector. So if high prices do reach them, then we could see increase on their half in terms of investment, so that they increase production, and in that way also they would surely increase their income and so forth.
In Dubai, Mr. Khayat, what's the correlation between rising oil prices and food prices? Are the two directly linked?
Basically, there is a shortage. The world has 1.3 trillion barrels of firm reserves, oil firm reserves. If we are consuming around 32 to 35 billion barrels a year, this means in 40 years' time we will have a real shortage. There will be a real penury in the world. So what's happening now, because markets are aware of this fact, prices, and there is some disruption in the petrochemical downstream premiums production in the world. This has been disrupting the prices, increasing them to a level where now a lot of countries, especially Brazil, United States, and Western Europe, India, and China, are converting a lot of their food stuff into ethanol. Let's not forget, for example, that just to fill a 25-gallon SUV gas tank with grain, this will cover the need for a person over one year, even more. If we fill this gas tank 25 times a year, which means once every 2 weeks, this will be enough to feed 26 persons. Let's imagine that the United States, that is responsible for 70% of the world exports of corns that enter in so many, in a variety of products, even in refrigerators manufacturing. This United States is converting at a very high speed a lot of its corn production, 14 million tons a year, into becoming ethanol to cover the shortage in fuel. So we have a real problem, and this is increasing the prices, like we've seen with the sugar, for example, in Brazil, which is the first producer and exporter of sugar cane in the world. It has been converting half of its production to become ethanol used as a biofuel. But this has caused a shortage of 10% on the world market, and this has been reflected in doubling twice the prices of sugar. There is no cheap sugar anymore because of this introduction of new usage of the food and the sugar cane.
Let's bring in Mr. Abbasian in Rome. Do you concur? Do you think that biofuels, for however good they are in combating climate change, have been a major culprit in contributing to the food shortage?
There are issues about biofuels that, if you allow me, I can comment on. I do not think that I can agree with many comments just made in many aspects. First of all, taking sugar. We have a surplus of sugar right now. In fact, sugar is about the only non-performing agricultural crop. Its prices hasn't been increasing, has been declining from the highs it reached about 2 years ago. And sugar ethanol is purely Brazil issue. When we're talking about ethanol per se from grains, it's really we're talking about corn, and we're talking about US, as rightly mentioned. However, let us not forget that in the US, whereas was correctly mentioned, maize is a very important crop. US is the biggest exporter to the world and is the biggest user of maize. Maize production in the US increased so much this year to the record level, 18% planting increase, about 40 million ton increase in maize production in 2007. Just to put this in perspective, the 40 million ton increase in maize production in the US is equivalent to the entire maize production of the European community. So this was the potential for increase in production to meet the demand for ethanol in the US, which is extremely high, plus feeding the United States and exports. Now, having said that, it does not mean that this new emerging market, which is called ethanol, is not having an impact. Indeed, it has an impact. It came at the wrong year, just when many exporting countries had very, very short supply for exports, namely Australia, but also Europe, Canada. And having had this supply problem from exporter side, and then all of a sudden this sudden increase from the new emerging demand from ethanol partly because all these plants that have been invested became to kind of operation during the course of 2007, made the world supply-demand situation extremely tight, and this resulted in high prices. So yes, ethanol was a factor in driving up prices, but I think the most important factor this year was in fact the production problems we saw in major exporting countries, plus extremely low reserves. Stocks, that is, which is a result of few years of decline in world reserve levels. So we have a supply situation which is a problem, plus this new demand, which obviously puts more stress on the market.
All right, I'm going to ask Mr. Khayat in Dubai. Mr. Khayat, should Arab states be investing oil revenues into developing agriculture? Do you think that that is likely?
Yes, I think we believe that, for example, Sudan can afford to sustain such a huge investment in developing real agriculture that can yield crops that could sustain, for example, demand in part of the Arab world, the whole of the Arab world. We have other parts of, for example, we have in Morocco, in Algeria, some parts of Algeria, even Tunisia. Many parts of the Arab world are still underdeveloped when it comes to really support the rural population and coming up with real investments, with real infrastructure that can sustain the big need for increasing the supply. Some projects are still blocked, not because there is no real vision on how to do that. We have seen some slight moves coming, like let's say from Abu Dhabi recently, when they were started investing in real alternative energy. But we haven't seen a real strategy in the Arab world to use some of the surplus coming from the oil income into this mainstream of increasing production in let's say Sudan, even Africa, some neighboring countries that are there that can help increasing the productivity and in the agricultural sectors. So this is not happening because there is no strategy. Also, there is no real policies, and also the political environment in some areas, like in Sudan, is not contributing into doing this. We have seen some projects in Sudan, but they are very limited, and there is no real policy. In Morocco also there is the drought, there is need to build more dams, to big infrastructure to sustain such developmental projects, but we haven't seen that happening because of the lack of strategy, not because of the lack of investments.